Today I'm going to talk about a book. This is Heidegger.
878. 878.
Yes, 878. Sorry, really need some water. Robert Magliola, famous Derrida interpreter, maybe one of the best, wrote a book called Derrida on the Mend. It was produced in 1984. And I would say this is possibly the most brilliant exposition of Derridian differentialism, or what you usually call difference in action, where difference really is the working gesture of the text. And there is a comparison made between Derridian differentialism and differentialism coming from Nagarjuna, often called Buddhist differentialism. But I am not completely sure, because the last couple of decades it's been argued that Nagarjuna might not be of the Buddhist tradition at all. He has been incorporated in the Buddhist tradition, but originally he might not have been part of the Buddhist tradition. That is quite a comparison, and that also shows how far you have to go from the Western culture to find anything similar to Derrida. And for me this strikes a note. There is clear indication that Heidegger took his first initiative into his destruction coming from Kyoto and the Kyoto School of Philosophy. We've spoken, I think, only one time about Nishida and his take on what is ontological in comparison to the ontic. So the whole idea of trying to observe how something is instead of seeing how it actually came to be could have actually come from Kyoto and the Kyoto School of Philosophy. The thing Magliola takes up here and compares to difference is the concept of shunyata. Shunyata is often compared to emptiness, or sometimes even more specified as the emptiness of emptiness. And this have a clear connection to the Chandrakirti that we mentioned many times, and that's the tetralemma, a different kind of take on logic, where we have not only true and untrue, we have both untrue and true, and neither untrue and true. And that logic seemed to have been at the very foundation of both Buddhist thinking and Nagarjuna. It is much older than both traditions. So it seemed to be a natural circumcision, and it could actually have been that the tetralemma was the natural before the development in ancient Greece. Magliola was the first one to compare Derrida to some Eastern tradition like Buddhism or Nagarjuna. And he does it with an incredible engagement when it comes to speculation. He has earlier attained similar studies of Nietzsche, Wittgenstein and Bergson. One thing that is a bit strange with Magliola, and I find it very interesting, is he does not devote the whole book, Derrida on the Mend, to Derrida and Nagarjuna. He adds actually some literary criticism that goes back to earlier phenomenology and literature. And he also has a discussion on Heidegger as a quasi-Taoist logocentric mystic. So it's quite interesting. And there have been some discussions also about the concluding chapter that might be the most different I've seen so far in any Derridian interpreter, and that he has a whole chapter about Christian differentialism. And he goes all the back to the Ancient Testament. I think my colleague would be interested in that one, because there is a lot of reference to the Old Testament and the Torah. And what he tries to do is to have a circumstantial language look at the classical Trinitarian speculation, and also a look into the mystical and paradoxical manner of Angelus Silesius. And you could say that there is a lot of appeal to fundamentalism there in this chapter, and it's rather interesting, I find, but I don't really understand it. Magliola's book is renowned to be very complicated, and complicated in that manner you need to have a lot of background knowledge. So it's complicated in a way, I would say it's different to Rodolphe Gachet's book, which takes a lot of training and method practice, and actually a lot of creative thinking to get into. When it comes to Magliola book, it's not enough. You need to have a lot of background knowledge. But I will try to get into more of that book. After this, I will take a deeper look. Magliola goes mostly into, when he speaks about Derrida, self-identity. And he means that Jacques Derrida, his whole destructionist project is an attack on self-identity. That we are, so to speak, the mirror image that is constantly the same. This perfected idea that some sort of identical sameness is a possibility, and that it's actually abundance of sameness in the world. And he goes to reduce the whole issue of self-identity to it being a matter of personal self-identity. And when I read that, I felt it's very interesting, because I have for a very long time taken a very strong look at what's around us, what I perceive to be around us. We've spoken about the objects, we have looked at how perception works, we talked about affordances coming from Gibson's, which is might be a first step to take a more closely look at self-identity, but still not. And only in the last couple of lectures I took a more close gander at the I, the ego, and it doesn't appear that much in quantum mechanics, for instance. We just say the observer, but we don't talk about how is the observer constructed, and what is its essence, or how does it turn up. All those things are quite interesting. And of course, this self-identity, us being completely identical, has been questioned earlier by Julian Barber, oddly enough. He's a physicist. But he always used to say when he started his lecture, I'm not the same person that dressed for this lecture. Neither is the same person that went to bed yesterday. And that is actually a physicist's deconstruction of self-identity. And of course, as we know after all these lectures about deconstruction of text, that self-identity in text sort of rid the text of all its depth and difference, and makes the text shallow and unreadable. And of course, Derrida's mission is to bring difference back as a spice to the books, to the text. And Magliola goes further. He means that it starts possibly with the idea of self-identity in ourselves. Sorry. Yes, sorry about that. Let's continue. One quote from page 5 going over to 6 is that personal consciousness makes up a citadel, a closure. And this is similar to the thing I mentioned in the previous lecture, 877. And that is that there is a closure if you start looking for sameness in the text. This idea that a word is monosemic, it's a very personal take. It's not general, it's not something that can be shared with anyone, and it makes reading completely, I would say, unreachable to penetrate the text if you have that standpoint. And if you turn the table a little bit and look at what is behind the construct of identity in the outer world, in the word or in the objects, it starts with an identity in the self, that I am constantly the self, the same self. I am constantly Hans Johansson. And this is where Robert Magliola puts his knife. He wants to have a look at the self, and he questions in a very Derridian manner the self-identity of the ego, and that it is rather something that is constantly, perpetually different, and almost like the essence of being a person is its difference. And similar to the text losing its flavor, we lose our self-consciousness if we try to or achieve some sort of self-identity. This is blocking out consciousness itself. And this is actually very similar to the Gödelian paradox. If we have a self-contained system, the self is a little bit like Hilbert thought about mathematics. It was a self-servant, consistent, non-contradictory system that made its own working. There is no place for reflection or self-consciousness, because everything is automatic, ruled by cause and effect within the system, and nothing can look at the system at itself. Self-reflection becomes completely impossible. If you move that from mathematics to yourself, if you are self-consistent, non-contradictory, there would be no self-consciousness. And this rings very true to my ears. This is exactly what we have today. Speaking from the science of cognition, we know today people are lacking in self-consciousness. We don't seem to be able to look at ourselves anymore. And I think that is the getting rid of the soul aspect of a human being. I think most people today, the absolute majority, think that we only are maybe a body and a psyche. And the psyche is very close to the body somehow. In that manner, it is not active. It's a passive receiver of the surroundings. A little like René Descartes said that I just take in and I'm completely equivalent to my thoughts. Where does the thought stem from? From the surroundings. In the Descartes model, the Cartesian model, there is no self-consciousness. There's nothing that can actually understand. Understanding is somehow blocked out of the picture. You are your thoughts. And that actually reminds me, somebody said to me many years ago, I think it was about Norwegians or Swedes, I don't remember. He said that an Englishman who drinks a lot of alcohol he becomes a drunk Englishman. Whereas a Swede that drinks a lot of alcohol, he becomes somebody who is only drunk. It's not the person that is drunk, he is the drunk, because he behaves in a manner that is completely automatic. That does remind me a little bit about this idea that there doesn't exist any consciousness anymore, not anything higher, so to speak. We are one level beings only. And of course the mathematics of Hilbert and all the mathematicians at the turn of the second last, the penultimate century, they thought everything was on the same level. Because in a non-contradictory system there is no above level. Nothing that can look upon what you think or the mathematical actions. Neither can it in the mechanical universe of Newton be something higher organizing principle. This is why Newton and all his all the ones who came after him thought that God left creation. God created the laws of the universe and all the forces and all the localization points. But after his creation, he left the creation. He's no longer with us. And it might seem like a really weird worldview of Newton, but since he remained a Christian, that was his worldview. And that continued maybe 50 years after Newton, and then it was rather easy to take God away completely because he didn't have any doings in the world. This is similar because if you have a soul or a psyche like is self-consistent and self-identical, and you start thinking that you are always identical to yourself, all chances of anything higher, a guiding principle, disappears. Also a bit similar to Frederick Matthias Alexander, who said in the early 19th century that people do not longer control themselves. They don't have individual will. So they do things automatically, something he called misuse. And oddly enough, misuse is very similar to one another. When we misuse ourselves, we do it all in the same way. There is no one who tends the back of their thigh. What we tense is in front of the knee, and that is always the same. The misuse is scary similar. And I think this is very close to this idea of modern human beings as being unconscious that Magliola points to. Magliola tries to expound the Derridian position in a series of logical steps. He begins where it began for me as well, with the Saussurian principle of arbitrariness of signs, something that later was radicalized by Derrida in the claim that all is writing. From the leveling of signifiers, one proceeds to the leveling of signifieds. So you start with the signifiers and you understand that the only thing that sort of discerns a P from a T is the shape and the difference in between them, and then you can go over to the signified, actually the thing you're pointing to, your intention or what's in the world, and you can start thinking about that as being only difference and nothing else. I'm not using difference in the normal Saussurian sense. That was radicalized, and he said in the end, well, he didn't exactly say that, but everything is writing in a way because it's just sheer difference. And then you have come into the idea of difference instead. Let's go into the juicy point here, because it's getting rather chilly here. I'll make a jump here in the book. when we come to the last chapter about Christian and Jewish theology, we have a cultural ensemble that has already been largely Hellenized. And that was actually something that did ring a bell in my head. One can argue, he continues on page 116 to 17, one can argue that the original heterogeneous element of Judaism and Christianity were never completely eradicated by Western metaphysics. They perdure throughout the centuries, threatening and unsettling the assured identities of Western philosophy. That's rather interesting. And he tries to restore a certain logocentric theological discourse. That's his aim. And he also uses Nagarjuna here. He comes in. This is the last shoot before we go in. Nagarjuna shows that a carefully reasoned logocentrism leads to pure negative reference. One must conclude then that all happenings, being utterly dependent, must be empty of self-nature and empty of entative transfer of continuance. This is a sort of a deconstruction of self-identity itself. And saying self-identity is empty doesn't mean empty in the Western sense. And I think this is the most important. When we say empty in Western metaphysics, we mean in contrast to existence. This is not the emptiness that Nagarjuna is talking about, neither Robert Magliola. What he's speaking about is the emptiness as such. The emptiness where existence have the potentiality to exist. So there's a big difference. The first one is an ontic emptiness, where you already have existence and then you forgot how it was made. And you make a comparison to the existence, my self-identity, or the identity of this table, and you compare it to what's around. So you define what's around by contrast to what exists. That's the ontic movement. The emptiness, like shunyata, is not that emptiness at all. And that's a common misconception that Magliola actually brings to the fore. And I actually read that before. Arkady Plotnitsky takes it up as well, and so does Rudolf Gachet. But it's very interesting because so often in Eastern tradition this gets confounded, and it's not the same thing at all for any cause. And this is the mistake of Alan Watts, who sees Buddhism as something of a nihilistic project, that everything is useless in the terms of not being existence. So he builds in something negative from the start. Yes.
Yes, people call even Heidegger nihilist,
Yeah,
but I think it's a
mistake as well. Definitely. Very well. Here. And that is very interesting. And then we naturally come into the Seinsfrage. And I haven't looked so much into the chapter of Heidegger, but I don't think it's that bad actually. I think it's quite interesting, because once you start to understand this different use of emptiness, you start giving more credit, or you start understanding Heidegger. Otherwise Heidegger is going to be blocked out of vision, and it's going to be that conformal read. But it's also an excellent example. It is not actually about misreading. It's me taking my self-identity into the reading of a book, maybe Heidegger's book, and I sort of distort it. Deconstruction, as Magliola did here, opens up the reading once more. And once you start understanding this emptiness is actually something of a potentiality for existence. Then all of a sudden you understand amnesia much better. And I met so many people who are interpreters of Heidegger, read them mostly, I would say, but I met you as well. And they done that mistake. And I was never able to point at it, say, you made a mistake. It felt like a mistake, but I couldn't point to it. But this is also something that was helped by Rodolphe Gachet's book. But now I understand emptiness in this form is much more knowledgeable, something you really can get into. And it's not that simple in a very good way. It could get more and more interesting and more advanced. That emptiness is not as evident, not that obvious as the negation of existence, which Alan Watts braves about. And Schopenhauer, I think Schopenhauer did the same mistake. I'm really going on a thin limb. People are going to murder me criticizing Schopenhauer. But Schopenhauer was this nihilistic person because he got influence from the East, and he thought it was some sort of liberating nihilism. Give all hope up, and that is going to save you. I don't think so. It's a misread in some instances. It's a lack of knowledge from Schopenhauer's part. Now I'm kicking at the great philosophers. I should be ashamed of myself. Let's finish off here before I go too far. I say thank you very much, and I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.